So cluster B, continue our conversation about personality disorders, has four. The other each have three. And the three of these hang together quite closely. So borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder really hang together quite closely. Antisocial personality disorder is different in important ways than these three, though it is sometimes hard to differentiate between narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. So antisocial personality disorder is what many people will sometimes refer to as people who are sociopaths or psychopaths. You might hear them referred to as sociopathy or psychopathy. But from a psychiatric point of view, from a psychological point of view, what we're talking about here is a disorder, antisocial personality disorder. And that the main distinction here, the main defining feature here is about this absence of empathy for other people. And so what if we have no empathy for others, it means we can hurt them, we can cause bad things to happen to them, without feeling guilt, without feeling bad about that in any way. And people with this disorder engage in highly manipulative behavior. People who become serial killers have this disorder, but most people with this disorder do not become serial killers. They may swindle people out of money, they may do other things. Um, in order to get the diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder, you need to have met criteria for conduct disorder, which is a childhood disorder. You need to have met that criteria for that. So no one may have diagnosed you with that in childhood or adolescence, but looking back, you need to have met criteria. But lots of kids and adolescents who meet criteria for conduct disorder won't grow up to have antisocial personality disorder, so it doesn't work the other way. Um, as we'll talk about in the next slide, treatment for antisocial personality disorder is very, very difficult, in part because the lack of empathy for other people, the lack of sense of connection to other people, means that it's very hard to form a relationship with a therapist, and most people are not going to seek out treatment on their own. They're going to be mandated for treatment because of legal problems or other problems. And so treatment is rarely successful here, at least like psychotherapy treatment. These other three, borderline personality disorder, histrionic, and narcissistic, are mostly characterized by disruptions in relationships in one way or the other. So borderline personality disorder is about instability in relating to other people, so vacillating quickly between highly valuing a person in their life and then really devaluing the person in their life. We also see erratic mood and behavior, and people with borderline personality disorder are often challenging to have relationships with because of these things. Histrionic personality disorder is about highly emotional, melodramatic behavior, and their interactions with other people are sometimes difficult for others because of how emotional and melodramatic they are. But the distinction between histrionic and borderline personality disorders is that borderline personality disorder, the disruption really is about how they think about and sustain or don't sustain relationships with other people. Whereas histrionic, there's not a disruption to the ability to sustain relationships, but some people may find it taxing in some way to continue to interact because of how emotional and melodramatic the behavior is. Narcissistic personality disorder is about an inflated sense of self. It is about somebody who really thinks that they are special in some ways and deserve special treatment in some ways and seek special treatment in real ways. And again, you can imagine how that might be difficult to deal with in a relationship, and yet it's not that they deliberately disrupt relationships in the way that borderline personality disorder often results in. Cluster B, in terms of etiology, it used to be, so when I was in school, that the prevailing thought about cluster B was that it was all about bad parenting, all about parenting that did not result in secure attachment and resulted in difficult ways of interacting with people. What we now know is that there's really a lot of genetic evidence for genetic etiology, and that we don't completely dismiss parenting, but that there really does seem to be a very biological basis for these four disorders as well, especially I would say for borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, whereas histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders probably still have a great deal of environmental influence on them. Cluster C is this kind of anxious cluster, and here you'll see a lot of overlap with other disorders we've talked about earlier in the semester. So avoidant personality disorder is about this fear of rejection and criticism. It's really easy to see overlap with social anxiety here, and the difference is with social anxiety, usually the person has groups of people, even if it's just family, where they don't feel social anxiety, and that may not be the case here with avoidant personality disorder. Dependent personality disorder is about overly relying on other people and overall lack of self-confidence. And again, remember, we're talking about persistent patterns. So this happens in almost all situations or relationships in their life, where they may not be able to make decisions on their own. They may not be able to think about going any place on their own, that they really rely on somebody else or other people to make decisions for them. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder, right? This sounds very much like OCD, but it's not. It is not about compulsions and obsessions. It is about a style of moving through the world, right, which is what we keep coming back to, that is about rules and details and perfection. And so it is about a very rigid approach to moving through the world, but not having rituals in the same way that we've talked about, or at least not rituals that are about managing the anxiety of an obsession. And that is the difference there. And again, we see some genetic etiology here, probably most for obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but avoidant and dependent, while there may be some genetics in play, we also think a lot about personal history informing these. When we think about treatment for these, the most challenging piece of treatment is whether or not people with these disorders seek out treatment, and often they don't. Remember, this is how they have always felt, this is how they've always moved through the world, and so often it's harder for them to identify the idea that something is disrupted that needs to be fixed, because they just feel like this is the way they are. But when we do have a chance to treat these people, psychotherapy focuses on increasing their awareness of how their behavior disrupts relationships and how different behavioral choices might in fact change how they're perceived and how they therefore move through the world. We also include medication in treatment for many of these disorders. And so for cluster A and some in cluster B, we often might use antipsychotics in some way, mostly in cluster A, but then also in cluster B, especially for borderline personality disorder, where the disruption of emotion can sometimes look almost psychotic. And those antipsychotics can sometimes even things out more. For cluster C, we often see the use of SSRIs, and for that, a component that is more anxiety based. And we also see SSRIs used for people in cluster B, especially again, borderline personality disorder there. And prognosis is poor compared to the other diagnoses we've talked about, but some of that is about how invested the person gets in treatment, and it can be very difficult to work with somebody where essentially you're telling them that many of the ways in which they interact with people or interact with the world need to be changed. And it's worst, as we said earlier, for antisocial personality disorder because they're not going to align with the therapist. And I think that prognosis for the others is really going to depend on a therapist who can form an alliance. And that can be tricky because, especially with cluster B, where it can often, the person's ways of interacting with a therapist, same as their ways of interacting with everybody else, can actually be angering or off-putting to the therapist. It takes a therapist with a strong commitment and a strong understanding of these disorders to maintain their sense of alliance with these clients, as opposed to getting annoyed with them and taking things that they do personally in some way. And in cluster A, the difficulty there is that people in cluster A are really not looking to form relationships, and so it can be very, very challenging. That's the cluster that's least likely to show up and seek treatment. Actually, is that cluster A. So we'll talk about these more in the online discussions. You have case studies that will help us elaborate this discussion some, and we'll go from there. Okay, thank you.